publishers of How to Make America Utopia, Take Away the Economy from Those Who Rigged It, As I See It, Class Warfare, The Only Resort to Right-Wing Doom, It's Worth It, How to Talk to Your Right-Wing Relatives, Friends, and Neighbors, and other books written by Egberto Willis. Welcome to Politics Done Right. I am your host, Egberto Willis. This is a progressive program that will take the mystery out of politics. This is the program that will encourage you to make sure government becomes we the people. Whether you are liberal, progressive, conservative, or otherwise, you get to air your point of view. We are an independent media outlet that, unlike mainstream media beholden to corporations, we only owe allegiance to you. Remember, you can also send me a tweet at EGBERTOWILLIES. That is at Egberto Willis. Let us engage. It is Politics Done Right. Welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. I'm Egberto Willis, your host. Today we have the honor of speaking to somebody special who wrote a special book. You guys are going to love this interview. Tracie McMillan is a renowned investigative journalist who has been reporting on the multiracial American working class for more than 2 decades. Her debut, The American Way of Eating, won a Sidney Hillman Book Prize, was a James Beard Foundation Award finalist, and was compared to Nickel and Dime by Dwight Gardner of the New York Times. McMillan's new book, The White Bonus, Five Families and the Cash Value of Racism in America by Tracie McMillan, combines rigorous journalism with a vulnerable, probing memoir. In it, she poses an urgent question. If racism denies people of color so much, here's the question. Just how much does it give white people not an amorphous privilege, but in dollars and cents? It's my pleasure to have you here. Tracie, how are you doing this morning?
I'm really well, Egberto. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Look, I've been intrigued with the book. I hadn't been able to read. It's one of the better documented books. I mean, everything is annotated. I mean, I don't know why you may. There's no question that everything that you did in this book seemed to have some basis in fact that people can cross-check, double-check the whole works. That is journalism that you don't see today. So thanks for writing the book.
Thanks.
Now tell me, why did you do it?
Yeah, I wanted a better way to talk about my experience in the world, right? I'm a white person who didn't grow up with a ton of money. But I understand that racism is a thing in the world and it happens. And when there would be these conversations about white privilege, I would get sort of stuck, right? Because I'd be like, well, I'm not Elon Musk. My parents didn't bankroll me through college and give me a down payment. Like, what did being white really get me, right? Because so often when we talk about white privilege, we're really talking about racial and class privilege, right? We're saying like, oh, your parents paid for all these things, blah, blah, blah. But actually, most white people in America don't have parents who are bankrolling them, right? So what does that stuff look like for me and for us? And I also just felt like, we need to be honest about how racism works if we're going to dismantle it. It seems really clear that racism is, impoverishing our democracy. It's eviscerating our safety net. It's making life worse and worse for many people, not just people of color. And I wanted to understand both what I got, so then I could also talk about what it costs us.
Now, the reality is, in these times, in the times of Trump, in the times of you will not replace us and all these types of things, it is not an easy thing to do because you're a white person. You can just, go with the flow, whether you don't really have to put yourself at risk to write something like this. Did you have any concerns as far as what it would do for you career-wise or other to write such a book?
I mean, not when I pitched it, right? I mean, I pitched the book in 2019. I got a sizable contract, right, that let me work on the book full time for the last several years. I mean, I had to take out a loan and things like that to get through this gets into the weeds about how book payments work, right? But,
Mhm.
I got significant enough interest from publishers that I thought, well, like their job is to find books that will sell and be important. So that seems okay. And I love my work as a journalist, but I'm a freelance independent journalist. I'm not bought into the larger institutions the way that somebody who's on staff somewhere is, right? So maybe it hurts my career in some small way, but it just doesn't seem there's some ways in which like my career is not, it's not like my career is so deeply valuable, right? That, if it goes a little sideways, I'm always finding other ways to make money. So,
Well, actually, I do think it's. I beg to differ. I think this is one of the, again, in reading how it came from me, I think this is one of the most important books that's been written right now. And one of the reasons, and I don't know if you follow what I do, but there's a paragraph in your book that I said, "Oh my God, these are the things that I speak about almost on a daily time in my thing." And it goes as follows: there are so many things that I could not see. I could not yet see how many assumptions that I was not supposed to get food stamps came from racism and other forms of cruelty. I'd internalized things that ran so deeply I could not have told you they were there. I would have told you that they were not for me because I was educated and had options. But the shameful truth is that I did not think food stamps were for people like me because I felt material need was something that only really happened to people that were not white. And let me tell you something. Today on my KPFT program in Houston, in getting a thing across to some of my white audience, it was I kind of mentioned the Appalachian story and let them understand that one of the reasons many of them could have the feelings that they had is because they couldn't see themselves in Appalachia because they didn't know about Appalachia. What a book like yours do is it opens the door for things that people think and just let aside, but you give them a reason to think a bit deeper, which is why I loved what you're doing.
oh, thank you so much, Victor. Thank you for telling me that. I think that's one of the reasons that doing this book as memoir was really important. Because so much of the way that white Americans engage with questions around race and deserving and the role of government, all that, there's a lot of deeply internalized thinking about race and equity there. And, I'm a good reporter, but pulling that out of multiple strangers, right, that takes years of work. And I didn't feel like I had enough time to pull that out of strangers and that I could do a better job if I was just pulling it out of myself. So that's really special that seems to have worked.
Yeah, actually, it does. You've written about white resentment and white poor for places like New York Times. What did you learn about white grievance in reporting the white bonus? And explain what the white bonus is, because a lot of people would likely mistake the white bonus and white privilege intertwined but different.
Right. So the white bonus is a variation or subset of white privilege that's very specific, right? So white privilege is kind of this amorphous thing where we say, oh, well, you have white privilege, but do you have class privilege? Do you have able-bodied privilege, right? And you get stuck in these stupid arguments about like which oppression is worse, right? And I didn't want to have that conversation. I said, okay, well, if we figure out a way just back of the envelope to measure what people get for being white in terms of money, that might change the conversation a little bit, right? So the white bonus is a rough back of the envelope estimate of the amount of money an individual white person got or saved because of white supremacy and public policy or private practice, right? So that can be money that you inherit from your parents that they had because there was discrimination in mortgage lending that worked in their favor, right? Like that sort of stuff, as well as, employment discrimination that works in my favor, housing discrimination that works in my favor, all of those things, right? And then, there's enough social science to sort of be able to say, well, I don't know exactly how much that definitely meant, but I do know that, say, the wage premium for a white person over a Black person, right, is, I think it's generally speaking at least 10 to 20 points,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, all right, well, like if I was making $1 an hour, then that's, 20 points above what a Black person was making. So I was making 20 cents on the dollar more, right? And then calculating that out.
And you did that. You, like I said, the chart that you did, that chart was was great. The chart that you have in the book, I think it's titled "The Tracie's White Bonus." I love the way and then you separated it into white bonus and white bonus family, white bonus social. And I tell you why that is important. I think that is important because you were able to come a lot of this from a personal standpoint. A lot of people think when people talk about this subject like yourself, that they are talking in some abstract fashion. You're sitting down in an ivory tower talking about this stuff. A lot of this stuff you've lived it. Now, talking about the bonus as an example, I had a friend, a good friend, a white guy. Both of us started business together. We went to the same bank to get $40,000. They invited him in. He had no collateral. He got the $40,000 loan. They looked at me and told me, don't even bother filling out an application because, you don't have collateral. So I financed my business on 18 to 22% credit card debt, while he financed his on 6% debt. These are things that when you came out and put that numerically out, you show, and again, coming from someone like you, it's like, oh, wait a minute, I can actually see it. And very rarely do you find that authors are able to self-instantiate the things that they're talking about. You brought in subjects. How did you find them?
Yeah, so it was really important actually that I had the first person stuff when I went out to find people to work on this book. Journalists, are sort of trained to be like, okay, you go and you find strangers and you say, hey, stranger, you're having this experience that I don't know anything about. I need you to tell me about it so I can tell other people, right? But it'd be a little much for me to go up to other white people and be like, hey, stranger, you're white. I don't know anything about that. Would you, right? Who would trust me? Right. So I just felt like I had to do the first person stuff. And then finding the subjects, right? That was a mix of people I already had some personal connection to, and then more traditional journalistic routes of like going through advocacy organizations, or sort of other professional contacts, right? So, for instance, I have a chapter that's about a union nurse in Pittsburgh, right? She's a member leader with SEIU. And so I had gone to SEIU and said, hey, this is the project that I'm working on. I know you guys do a lot of thinking about how race works with your members, particularly in Pittsburgh, because that is a majority white city. So even though SEIU is mostly people of color, right, they have a lot of white members there. Do you have anyone that might want to talk to me? Right. And so they helped me find somebody and then really just left me alone, right, which was great. When I went to find the millennial women in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, right, who'd gone through the public schools as they were resegregating. Those are folks that, my first book, right, was about food. So I was friends with people in sort of the world of food in Mississippi. So I knew a bunch of journalists and writers and photographers and started reaching out and being like, does anybody know anyone?
Let me break a second and keep up to say that, because you talk about that first book actually brought some of this, the subject of racism into your, not into your vision, but that it helped in you developing this book here. Why is that?
Yeah. So the first book, right, I worked undercover in 3 jobs in the food system. So I was a farm worker in California, a Walmart worker in Michigan, and an Applebee's worker in Brooklyn. And it meant that, 2 of those 3 jobs, I was the only white person in the workplace. And in the Walmart job, right, it was an integrated workplace, right, both Black and white and Hispanic workers there. And so to write that book, right, where I similarly used myself as a central narrative, right, I really had to think about why my job experience looked the way that it did, which meant I had to think a lot about both my race and my gender, right? And something that I really actually enjoy and appreciate about working class like America is that there's a much more direct articulation of race, right? People are much more comfortable. I mean, often in ways that in elite circles would be considered offensive, right? But you make a lot of jokes with each other about like, oh, what kind of guys are you into dating, right? Like that's a very like in integrated like female spaces, right? You make a lot of jokes about like, are you dating Black guys? Are you dating white guys? Like all of that stuff, right? And so I just had to spend a lot of time thinking about it, which, this is one of these hidden privileges that white people get in this country, right? Is that we're not raised to ever have to think about the fact that we have a race, right? And we do, right? We're white, we get given privileges and so on and so forth, but we're trained to think that we should be colorblind and not see race. And that just gives like white supremacy more power, right? Because it's hidden, so you can't fight it. So writing that first book was sort of my chance to be like, oh, like I am definitely getting treated differently, because most people just, life is hard. You work a lot. You want to spend time with your family. Most people don't have time to sit around and be like, I wonder why I was treated that way at work today, right? You're just like, oh, thank God I got through the day, right? So it was really special for me to do that book that then bled into this one, right? Because that book published in 2012, right? You have Trayvon Martin, you have Mike Brown, you have all those things happening and sort of like that level of racism becoming much more apparent. And then for me, as we got into the Trump election, I just, and I write about this in the foreword to the book, I was just like, I knew this. I knew this. I wasn't surprised when Donald Trump was elected. I was more like, oh, that's what I expected. And I talked myself out of it because I'm in these elite circles with very progressive people, right, on the coast who don't understand how hard it is for white people outside of their bubble, right? Because one thing Donald Trump was very effective at, right, was taking very real economic fear and instability, which is, rife throughout the industrial Midwest and rural areas, right, and start blaming it on race, right? And sort of and I'm not saying there wasn't racism there in the first place, but really pouring fuel on that fire, right? And being like, oh, like you feel unstable. Well, that's because like immigrants or Black people are taking your jobs, right? And sort of activating that. And you see that again and again in American history, right? That none of this is new. But it was really being able to do that first book that led me to this one.
It is amazing because, like I said, sometimes when I was reading some of the write-up on you, I felt like, wait a minute, are we sourcing the same things? Or wait a minute, is she a closet person listening to some of the stuff we talk about, or what? Because it's just amazing that the same conclusions that are coming from it. And what I love about it is these conclusions are coming from a white journalist, right? And the problem that I find, and this is where I'll go into the question about the myopia within the journalism, right? Because as it turns out, there are a lot of problems that have I call it a racial economic component. First of all, I'm the one that on my program always say race is one of the stupidest things out there, period. Bar none, race is the stupidest thing out there because technically speaking, and I don't even want to go into the subjects, but after you've lived together for a long time and see your wants, your ifs, your needs, and you find out, oh my God, you mean I care about my kid just as much as you do? You mean I care about these things just as much as you? You mean I even put my pants on just like you do? It's sort of a silly thing, right? That we just make pigmentation have such an effect on people. Now, as it turns out, like I said, when I read some of the passages and when I see it, it is like, why is it that journalists, the people who should be doing the investigative things, don't kind of open the door to Americans like your book will to quite a few people, especially given the source? Why is it that they're not doing their job and they're making the narrative come from those who have an ulterior motive in creating a false narrative?
Right. Well, I don't think that there's like a conspiracy afoot, right? But I just think that, white Americans don't learn the truth about racism in our country, right? Or about race, right? We don't learn, like you can absolutely be raised in America as a white person and not have to understand anything about how racism works, not have to understand that race affects you as a white person, not understand that it probably shaped your family's economic circumstance, right? There is no person of color in this country who doesn't understand that being white often opens financial doors for you, right? So one of the weird tricks with this book is that, like I talk to like white people and they're like, wow, I never really thought about how being white could be valuable, right? And people of color are like, the white bonus, I've been wanting a phrase for that. I've been watching this my whole life. Like, thank you for the phrase, right? So it's like a very different like thing. People ask me like, oh, who do you hope reads this? What do you want? I'm like, well, I hope for white people, it makes things like a little clearer and both like opens up a conversation about what we get so that we can also be honest about what we lose because of racism in this country. We lose a lot, including most white people. Not as much as people of color, right? But we're still.
But I'm gonna push back a bit. I think this book ought to be read by everybody, because I tell you, a Black person reading this book gives them. On my program, I speak to everybody, and I try to get whether they are rude to me, whether they call me by the epithets or whatever. I'm always one way and nice to them, and try to get through them. And I think what your book does for somebody that isn't white is to let them see the vulnerabilities that being white has as well. Because in reading your narrative, many of the things I'm like, there are times I'm looking at it and say, oh my God. Things that I know, but when it's written, when you write it down, it's like, and you don't even realize it. I mean, when you make a statement like that part that you made where you said, a person like me shouldn't be on food stamps. That's a profound statement, because it's instantiated into the heads of many people, right? And the answer that I gave this morning, in fact, I said, do you know what it feels like when that person in Appalachia goes out there and see all those executive Black folks that they normally would think, they were trained to believe a certain way things work, and they're having it hard as hell. And then Trump comes in with a false narrative, like they got there not on their merits, but because of something they're taking from you, right. And that's why I try to bring a whole lot of that into the argument. And your book, I think, cauterized it in many ways for everybody to see that, but for the it is like it's written for two audiences, right?
That's
go ahead.
The idea.
Well, you make it.
It's your book. White people.
It's your book.
Talk about the white people, but also, I mean, that's interesting. I hadn't thought so much about just being like, this is what it's like for broke white people, but for me, I'm hopeful that if nothing else, right, the book just takes the responsibility for explaining this off from people of color and gives a little bit of cover, right? Like I've been doing these public conversations, and some folks of color in the audience have been like, well, how do I bring this up like with my friends? Like, I have white people in my life that I care about, but this is a hard conversation. I'm like, well, I hope that at least like you could just be like, there's this book, did you see it? And you can start that conversation. So it's not about like, I individually have gone to my white friend to be like, we need to talk, Susan, right? You're just like, Susie, I heard about this book. Have you seen this? Right. And can sort of open up that conversation in a way that's a little easier and for folks to navigate.
Yeah, and I think that is the case. You have to find whatever avenue that you can use to get to people. And like I said, I think telling stories, right? And the good thing about it is you told your story and you told other people's stories. So nobody, when you write the book, can't say this is just an academic exercise. This is an exercise in reality from somebody who's known poverty, from somebody who's known their whiteness, from somebody who's known all these things. So there's nothing that the guy in Appalachia or the guy in the boardroom can tell you with the experience that you put the book out with. Your thoughts?
Thank you. Like, that's really nice. I mean, for me, I don't really get into academic like literature. And one of the reasons I work as a journalist is I want to be out there talking to real people and seeing how stuff works. Right. So like, there's nobody in the book that's like a cartoon white person, right? There's nobody that's a Karen, right? There's nobody from Appalachia even, right? That sort of stuff. Right. Everybody is like a middle-class white person, like from Connecticut to California, Mississippi, Texas, Michigan, Pennsylvania, right? And you can just sort of get a sense of like, all right, so for like these normal white folks, like, how does this stuff work? How valuable is it? And what do we all lose, right? Because one thing that, I hadn't really thought through, one of my subjects, right, is a boomer age woman who fell into working poverty and ends up dying because there's no Medicaid, right? That's a very short thumbnail of it. And I think a lot of people would sort of look at that and be like, oh, well, but like, I'm not going to fall into working poverty, so it's not going to affect me. But I think, she had 3 sisters, right? So the narrative is very much about like their loss. Like I came to her story through them. She's already, she's gone before I wrote the story. And, her sisters are economically fine, right? But they lost their sister. And I think that's a really important thing, right? Is that even if you individually are stably middle class and you have equity in your home and you've been stocking away for retirement and you think, I'm going to be fine in this system, somebody you love isn't going to be, right? You're going to know a young person who gets saddled with too much student debt, right? You're going to know somebody who needs public health care because they get a bad illness that is really serious and they can't afford it and they're out of pocket, right? All of that. And so the longer that we don't even address racism as a problem that everybody needs to worry about, right? The longer that stuff is just going to keep going. And I sort of picture this like, we built this system with like a hole in the floor that white people thought only Black people would fall through. And we didn't shore up the floor. We didn't repair the hole. And it's just getting bigger and bigger. And it's going to swallow more and more people unless we start doing something about it.
Well, this is not the subject of your book, but you've just defined the ills of capitalism. But but anyway, I mean, not to bring up another subject.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about silence. Talk to me.
Oh, like white silence?
Yeah, talk to me.
Yeah, well, I think, a lot of white people stay silent about racism in this country. And for me, like the way that I understand that is both, we don't understand it. We don't understand that there's a bonus exactly because nobody tells us about it. And so we just sort of like go along being like, well, the system seems to be working okay. And I'm going to like hope it stands. But at least in my experience, I think abuse is really common in families, certainly sporadic, like off and on abuse. And particularly with white families, right? White middle class families, very few people want to intervene, right? I mean, Black families that have difficulty with their kids, right, often will get policed by the foster care system, right? White families often don't have that experience, right? So you have all these kids growing up being treated poorly and nobody ever speaks up for them, right? Nobody ever says this is bad. This is certainly what happened to me, right? I write in the book about like a period during my upbringing when my father was being pretty violent and abusive. And what happened, right, is like everybody around me, right? I'm a 17-year-old kid, like in physical danger, and everybody was quiet about it, right? My stepmother, my grandmother. I later learned that the teachers in my school system knew that there was probably abuse happening and said and did nothing, right? And I think that trains people to stay silent about the abuse of other people, right? So if you come up and nobody cares about what's happening to you, why would you ever care about what's happening to other folks? And for me, again, that was part of the trick of using the memoir, right? Because I think it's both true that the experiences that I have had of abuse are probably the root of my deepest empathy around the experience of racism. When I hear folks talk about it, right, there's an echo there. It's the same mechanics, different scale, different heft, right? But it gives me an empathy. But it's also true that the way that abuse shaped my life at an early age meant that for a long time, I was a lot less likely to speak up or sort of stand up about things because, the thinking is sort of like, well, I never got that. Why would I do it for somebody else? And so for me, I wanted to sort of pull that stuff out because I think, the level of abuse that I experienced at home, I don't think it was very unusual, right? I think parenting is really hard. And I think a lot of parents like go through a period of like not being their best selves. And instead of talking about it, right, we just bury it. And I think that has really profound reflections in our larger culture.
The silence within the culture can actually cause problems we don't even expect. It's interesting because you also speak about, and this goes with regards to getting services from the government or getting support, etc., where you talk about some people believe they deserve it, but expect others to prove that they must. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, white Americans got a lot of help from the government, especially in the 20th century, right? So the creation of the American middle class, that was a government project that was aimed at white communities, right? So it wasn't written, this is only for white people, but was understood by government to largely be for white people. And it was understood that it would be implemented in a way that would really primarily benefit white people, right? But we never talk about that way, right? We say, oh, no, this is just what like white people get because it's what Americans get, right? And it hides it. And so you have that. So you're hiding this bonus. You're just acting like it is normal, but it's not, right? It's a gift from government, which God, everybody should get that, right? I think that's like one thing, like white people, I think tend to get like, well, if I admit that this was given to me, then I'm going to have to give it back. It's like, well, no, we don't have to give it back. Like, we just have to share. Right. And like, that's fine. And then, right, because we think that we got this thing that we're entitled to, then we're like, well, but for special help, you have to prove it, right? Because there's limited resources, which is not as limited as most people think. And then you got to prove that you really deserve, like, this help to like raise your family at home if you're not earning enough money, right? And things like that. And so, I came to this work really in part because I spent the 1990s covering welfare reform, right, under Clinton, and sort of how that changed the social safety net in this country and turned it from something where if you were broke enough, you got help. And now you have to prove that you're trying to work, even though this goes on a long tangent, right? And those kinds of punitive policies have become more and more common as we've gone forward, right? So work requirements are part of cash assistance. They are part of food assistance often. And there's a sort of a movement in Republican-led states to add work requirements to Medicaid, right? Which keep getting struck down in the federal courts because it is actually statutorily contradictory to the law, right? The law's intention is not anything about self-sufficiency or whatever language, which is
it's about what's needed. Yeah.
Right. It's about, you need to give people health care, right? Work requirements have nothing to do with that. But we keep making these systems more and more punitive. And it's this thing, right, where white people thought like we wouldn't be subject to that. And it's starting more and more, I think, to be hitting everybody.
Yeah, at the end of the book, so this is the second to last I'm going to make a statement, then I'm going to ask you the last question. At the end of the book, you have a difficult correspondence with your dad. I'm not going to ask you to go through that specifically, but I just want to tell you that at the end, the last paragraph was a gem because you said something that I think people need to understand. And that is, things don't have to remain the way they are, neither our economy, our social beings, or anything. We have the ability to make that change. And I love that. That is what that narrative implied. Our economy doesn't have to be the way it is. Things don't have to be the way it is. I think the more people learn that, the more people accept that it's within them to make the changes that are needed, the better meant for us all. But my last question is always the same. And that is, what would you have liked me to ask you that I didn't?
Oh, well, I've been sitting here like strategizing about that. What would I like to be asked? You didn't ask me about my grandfather.
I purposefully didn't ask you about your grandfather because for somebody who thinks that race is a stupid thing, right? There wasn't. I found the story interesting, but it was like, well, if I were to take the blood of just about every white person in America today, they would show some African descent. But tell the story. Go ahead.
Right. So it's just that, when I'm calculating the white bonus and going through my family, right, I realized that all of the inheritable wealth in my family really comes from one grandfather, right? I mean, there's some wealth on my mom's side, but really everything that got down to me came from my dad's dad, who's a banker, right? Became a banker in the 1920s when there were 250,000 bankers in the US and only 80 were Black, right? Had a racial covenant on his home. And I'm going through Canadian census records and find that, because he was born in Canada, that his mother, his uncles, and his grandfather are all categorized as African in the 1901 census, right? And it's interesting, right? There've been a few like online comments from folks who've read the book, and they're like, "This completely like ruins the entire book." And I'm like, "It doesn't, right?" Because the whole point, and I
wait, why did they think it ruined the book?
I don't think they were reading very carefully, or they didn't get this idea, right? That race isn't real, right? Race is a fiction that we treat as real. So you have to worry about racism because we use skin color to apportion power, right? So we have to worry about it. But race as a thing, like we made that up, right? Like it is no more important to like your intelligence or your abilities than like your eye color, right? Like this is ridiculous. And for me, it felt really important to flag that in the work, right? Particularly because that is something that showed up. I don't know how I would have worked that in otherwise. To be like, look, for all the power that we give to skin color, it's a fiction, right? Which means it could be different. We could do this stuff.
And I think that's great. I mean, I think the ultimate thing is that he made it because he passed.
Yeah.
He passed. He passed. So and that's the reason why I said I don't see why people would think that changed the gist of the book. In fact, I think it enhances the book if you take that down to its every level. It makes the book even more real. But anyway, look, Tracie McMillan, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you for writing this book. I think especially in these times, it's a necessary book.
Thank you very much, Egberto. This was really awesome. Thank you for being so thoughtful.
What's the opportunity cost of electing a Trump as opposed to a Biden, even as you may not like Biden, even as you may not think he's the ideal one, but you realize what you would have lost if you go with the guy just to punish somebody you don't like. And again, we have to be practical. We've got to be pragmatic. And that is what I intend to do. I imagine that's what most Americans are going to do. Ali Velshi is an award-winning journalist, host of Velshi and chief correspondent for MSNBC, and a weekly economics contributor to NPR's Here and Now. He has covered multiple U.S. midterm and presidential elections and significant news stories around the globe, including extensive reporting from Israel during the war with Israel and Hamas, Ukraine, and across Central and Eastern Europe during the Russian invasion, the Syrian refugee crisis from Turkey and Jordan, and the Iran nuclear deal in Tehran. He hosts the Velshi Banned Book Club on MSNBC and the Velshi Banned Book Club podcast. Folks, check those things out. You've got to listen to that. You got to watch it. There are a few cable or broadcast hosts and journalists who I listen to or learn from at face value based on the trust they have earned with their reporting. Ali Velshi makes that list that fits on one hand. Velshi has won numerous awards that I'll enumerate in the subsequent blog and article after this interview. Anyway, Ali, welcome to Politics Done Right. How are you doing today?
It's good to be with you, my friend. I also consume all the stuff you put out. And, I just love the fact that in this world where news can be very shallow, right? You get the headlines and you don't get the context, or you have a hot take on the last thing that happened. One of the things I love about you is it's like you read the whole story. You go all the way back and tell you, where did this start? How did it become the way it did? And I think that is so desperately needed in our news environment today. So thank you for having me on.
Well, I appreciate that, and ditto on that. Look, you wrote a very important book. I'll be honest. First of all, I read the preface, and then I kind of jumped through it. And I'll talk about what I jumped through before. But again, like I said, in reading the book, I said, well, look, I listened to Ali all of the times, and this is just a microcosm of who this guy has always been. So I am going to read the entire 300 pages, but I just have to do it over time. Anyway, sure. How to become an American in 3 steps got to me. And that you could make a movie out of that chapter. Look, you said it's 3 steps. The first step is arriving. The second step is the paperwork. The third step, I tell you something, really took to me. Here's what you wrote. You write this about being shot by the police, even as they knew you are a journalist. That was the moment, you said, that was the moment when I finally became a citizen in the deepest sense of the word, because that was the day I understood how invested in this place I truly need to be. One day I'll find out who shot me. And when I do, I'll go and I'll thank them, because what they did was open my eyes. They woke me up. They changed my entire outlook on democracy. That rubber bullet told me, you are in this fight. You are not watching it anymore. You are in it, whether you want to be or not. And that epiphany, in turn, is what led to this book.
Yeah.
Man, that is profound. Tell me about that.
Well, as journalists, we always struggle with, are we observers or are we in the story? And we try very hard not to be in the story, right? But as you know from my reporting, because you followed it for a long time, Not, I don't ever want to be the subject of the story, but I always want to be in it. Insofar as I'm always on the ground with people. In the Ukraine war, I was on the train platforms when people were coming in. I don't like to be on balconies. I like to be talking to people all the time about what's going on in their experience. So I don't have this division between journalists on high and everybody else out here. But what I realized in Minneapolis when shot, not that I was shot, people get shot all the time, shot by an agent of the state who, I haven't tried this in court, but I believe knew that we were journalists and we identified ourselves as such. And I realized at that point, you're not an observer. You can't say, wow, what a great job. I get to watch history unfolding. You're in history. And all of a sudden, it created this direct line 125 years back to my family, who had been people who had done things to try and better the society in which they lived, including fighting apartheid for a long time. Right? I have a grandfather who was Gandhi's youngest student. I have an uncle who was in jail for breaking the law and fighting apartheid. And I thought that when my parents came to these shores 50 plus years ago, that battle was over. That fight for democracy was over. We live in real democracies. Little did I know that democracy is a cactus, right? It's pretty hardy if you have it, but you can't just stick the cactus in a dark drawer and hope it grows. It needs some care and watering, and we are all in that fight. That's when I realized in that moment, I'm in it. I'm in it. It's not just my job to tell people what's going on, but to bear witness for them, to hold power to account. Police and later on, Donald Trump described that night in Minneapolis when I got shot as something far more colorful, but entirely wrong. It was entirely dishonest. It was this idea that we and the protesters were doing things that we simply were not, because it was live on TV. I was shot while live on TV describing a peaceful rally, a peaceful march into which the state police and the Minneapolis city police and the National Guard had come in and started firing tear gas and flashbangs and rubber bullets. If we're not there to tell that story, the story does not get told. And hence, we have to be part of the story of democracy. Democracy depends on an informed electorate. If the electorate does not know that the police are shooting at people who are not doing anything wrong, that the police are shooting at journalists to try and silence them, that the police want journalists curfewed because when journalists are curfewed, police get to do whatever they want to do. That's what happens in other countries. You and I come from other places. We know what happens when journalism is silenced and authorities get to do what they want to do. And that cannot be allowed to happen in America.
You have a very interesting history. You are a person that came from many places. You said you had so many passports. What does one more have to do with it? Tell us a little bit about that, because I think one of the reasons you are so good at what you do is because you have seen it from so many different angles, not only ethnically, not only racially, but in every single aspect. And I think to some extent, journalists, if they haven't lived it, they at least need to have learned about it. And our educational system is so poor that they don't. They just think glory, glory, hallelujah, and nothing else. So please expand on that.
We have to read. If we don't live it, and I have lived much of it, and I have, thanks to my employers, NBC and Al Jazeera and CNN, I have been around the world for these things. So when I was in Iran when we did the nuclear deal, but I was talking to Iranians the whole time. I was also interviewing vice presidents and politicians, and I do a lot of that, but that's half the job. The other half of the job is knowing how people live and how people think. And I really think that, look, in 2015 is when I became an American citizen. What did I care? I had a lot of citizenships, and I'm Canadian. Having a Canadian citizenship is probably one of the best citizenships in the entire world. I thought of citizenship as a series of rights, including the right to vote. And that's important, but I didn't care that much. In fact, many of us didn't care that much in 2015 because we weren't worried that democracy was coming apart. So what did my one vote in New York actually matter? What happened that night in Minneapolis is I learned that citizenship is not simply your right to vote or any of the rights you are accorded under the Constitution. It is your obligation to make society better. It is your I complained to a buddy who said, a Canadian who had become an American, who said, "Why didn't you become an American citizen?" And I said, "Well, I don't want to do jury duty." And she laced into me. She said,
I read that. Yes.
Yeah. She said, you want to enjoy the fruits of this country and the good things that it gives you, but you don't want to sit for jury duty. But her larger point was not about jury duty. I still haven't done jury duty, by the way. The larger point was you owe your society certain things. And in this perilous time in which we exist in 2024, in 25 years, when our grandchildren ask us, what is it you were doing when democracy was imperiled in 2024? You do not want to be able to say nothing. You do not want to be able to say, but I wasn't really paying attention. It didn't really affect me. It fully affects you. So my getting shot made me realize, because I'm not a black man in America who is in danger of dying when the police pull them over. I am an American citizen who understands that people are not treated equally in this country. So when a black man's life is snuffed out on video in Minneapolis, democracy and justice are not applied equally, and that applies to me. In 2024, today in America, you and I enjoy certain rights that every woman in our lives does not enjoy, which means democracy is not being applied fairly and equally, which means it is not finished yet. And because I come from a place where there was apartheid, I understand that when it's not equal for all, it's not equal for any. 6% of the population of South Africa, the white people, had the vote. They thought they had a perfect democracy. If you were white in South Africa, it felt amazing. But there's zero democracy. If there's not democracy for all, it doesn't exist. And that's what we have to realize. If you don't struggle to vote because of where you live, it doesn't mean that it's not your fight to make sure others can vote clearly. If you don't ever need to get an abortion, it doesn't mean that you don't have to fight for others who may need that one day. And that's what that date in 2020 when I got shot meant to me. I am in the fight the same way everybody else is. I do not have a privilege as a journalist to stand off to the side, watch what's going on, and tell you all about it.
You know, Ali, it's interesting because in the original journalist school of thought, it was person A says something, person B says something, and you just throw that out there. And what the Trump group, the MAGA group, and many others, even let's say during the Red Revolution, et cetera, what they've learned to do is they've used that supposed balance to abuse the system, to mislead the folks. And what I love about what some journalists, as I said, on one hand, they do is they force context. And that's what I see you're able to do in a manner that doesn't destroy the conversation, the dialogue. Right. Tell me a little bit about that.
And it shouldn't destroy journalism, right? I see it on Twitter all the time. People say if there's a discussion about whether it's raining, you don't book one person who says it's raining and book another person who says it's not raining. You open the window and you put your hand outside and you find out if it's raining, right? There's truth and there's bullshit. And we don't give them, we are not here to give them equal weight. What I am entirely prepared to give equal weight to people who are not lying to me. You may have a strong view about abortion or minimum wage or health care or whatever the case is. But if you are arguing honestly from where you come, maybe it's a religious belief, maybe it's a philosophical belief, but you're prepared to make the argument properly, you are invited onto my show to have a debate. And I will debate you even if my audience doesn't like you or your opinions. And I do it quite fairly often, as you know. I book people and I hear on social media, I don't know why you're giving this person a platform. I will give you a platform if you're being honest. If you honestly believe there should be no minimum wage or minimum wage should be lower or there shouldn't be universal health care. These are all things I believe should happen, right? I have my own views and I don't see anything wrong with my viewer understanding that I have views. There's this thing about objectivity in journalism, right? That you've got to be objective. Objective doesn't mean pretend you don't have opinions. I have opinions. I cover hurricanes, right? I have an opinion. Hurricanes are bad for people. They kill people. I cover tornadoes. Guess what? Tornadoes are bad for people. They kill people. I cover school shootings. School shootings are terrible. I'm against them. I'm absolutely against them. I'm also against lying. I'm also against people who run for office who are against democracy, because while you and I may not share views about how our country should be run, we share views about how we engage in civic activity, or at least we should. I'm not going to share views with you about the fact that this should be a dictatorship or this should be an authoritarian country. And yet there's one party right now running on the basis of a document called Project 2025, which is more than 800 pages long in great detail. And one of your obligations as a citizen is to read it. And understand that if you cast a ballot for members of that party, please don't come and complain to me in 2025 and 2026 and 2027 that you feel your rights have been curtailed because you voted for that. Do not vote for your rights to be curtailed. We are not fighting off missiles from another country who is trying to invade us. We have the vote. We have the right to make our own decisions in America, and that is the obligation of citizenship that I now hold because I now have an American passport. Now I am an American citizen. I must fight back the pressures on democracy, just like you must and everybody else must. As journalists, we stand no higher than anyone else. We are foot soldiers for democracy.
You know what is interesting? Imagine if all our journalists thought that way and realized that they are part of it. And
Yes.
if being a part of it means that you don't allow what we are trying like hell not to occur in this country right now. Very important. Now, let me ask you a difficult question. I know you have your book and you have the different blogs and stuff that you do on the side, but you also have a huge platform at a corporate station. You are one of the few that I see who is able to navigate that there are competing interests.
Yes.
How can you promote that to other journalists to understand that, yes, sometimes there are conflicts with the way we're going to tell a story, but
Yes.
we must find a way to tell a story in as much as we have those around us.
Correct. And I am not troubled by it. I understand that even where I work on some very serious issues that people feel very seriously about, there are different views. The various prospective hosts hold different views. There are so-called prevailing narratives about certain stories. But I will work with those hosts. I appear on their shows and they appear on my shows. I sub in, as you know, for various people whose views are not the same as mine, but I am a pluralist, right? I believe that the quality that we most hold, even as equal to democracy, is pluralism. The idea that we live in a world in which people hold different views, they have different faiths, they have different appetites, they have different diets, they have different lifestyles. And I am not here to tolerate yours. I write in my book, I think tolerance is a terrible word.
Thank you.
Tolerate what you do or your religion or your life or your skin color. It is for me to embrace the fact that both of us live in this place and share in its fruits. Because I came from a family who, by the color of your skin, they could not vote. They were not entitled to certain freedoms. So they came out of apartheid thinking, I want none of this ever again. I want none of this bullshit. People are not judged by their backgrounds and by their ethnicity and by their religion and by their sexuality and by their color or by their political views. So I do not hold it against anyone, including my colleagues who do not share my view on what I think are very important matters, including Israel-Gaza, right? I will continue to engage in them as long as they, and I believe they do, engage in good faith discussions about the whole thing. And as long as good faith discussions mean being open to debate. Be prepared to debate. You can't just hold opinions and not be prepared to argue why your opinions are there and not be prepared to listen to others. Look, Israel-Gaza, it's a complicated matter, man. It's been going on for a long time. If it weren't complicated, it probably would have been solved a long time ago. We're not going to get anywhere simply by yelling at each other. We're not going to get anywhere by calling people names. We're not going to get anywhere by accusing people of things. We're going to get places by continuing to engage in difficult conversations with people who do not share our views. And while I work in corporate America and I understand the limitations of that, I will say my employers have supported my right to do that, my right to engage in whatever dialogue I want to engage in with whatever guests I want to engage in or whatever colleagues I want to engage in. I sometimes get the sense that I'm swimming upstream or working against a prevailing narrative, but that's fine. I'm a journalist. I'm set up to do that.
That's why everybody needs to get small acts of courage, a legacy of endurance, and the fight for democracy, folks. That book is going to be listed in the article and the corresponding blog for this program. Ali, for everybody who I interview, there's always a last question, and it's because I know my limitations, and that is, what would you have liked me to ask you that I didn't, or what do you want to say that we hadn't touched on based on the interview thus far?
Well, the message in the book, it's an easy read. And part of it is people take all sorts of messages from it, right? Some people think it's a book about immigration. Some people think it's a book about ancestry. Some people think it's a memoir, but it's not. It's more about my family than it is about me. But fundamentally, it is an ode to citizenship. It is an ode to the idea that all of us can, in our own small way, change the circumstance we're in. Many of us feel very disheartened and overwhelmed by the political situation we're in, but we can engage, as you do, right? You engage all the time. You have not decided, I'm done. This is too hard. This is too much work. And the whole point of that book is that we all have the power to change something. You may not even live to see the change. But because that's what I write about in my family. My grandfather died in 1961 at the age of 58, thinking all his efforts had failed, and yet his son became a member of parliament, and his grandson is the guy you're talking to right now. So my point is, do not give up. Do not think that you are impotent. You are not. You have strength and you have power.
Ali Velshi, award-winning journalist, host of Velshi, and chief correspondent for MSNBC. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
Thanks for having me.
Support for this show, Politics Done Right, comes from politicsdoneright.com, publishers of How to Make America Utopia, Take Away the Economy from Those Who Rigged It, As I See It, Class Warfare, The Only Resort to Right-Wing Doom, It's Worth It, How to Talk to Your Right-Wing Relatives, Friends, and Neighbors, and other books written by Egberto Willies.
Welcome to Politics Done Right. I am your host, Egberto Willies. This is a progressive program that will take the mystery out of politics. This is the program that will encourage you to make sure government becomes we the people. Whether you are liberal, progressive, conservative, or otherwise, you get to air your point of view. We are an independent media outlet that, unlike mainstream media beholden to corporations, we only owe allegiance to you. Remember, you can also send me a tweet at EGBERTOWILLIES. That is at Egberto Willies. Let us engage. It is Politics Done Right.